we were having this conversation, and I was like, "Oh, making something look painted is easy. You just have to add a gradient." And this is actually a pretty bad example as to give as a photograph, to give as a like a photographic example of it, because the lighting is so even. Like we have this like figure here where it's like there's bright light kind of emanating from everywhere. So we've got a lot of ambient occlusion and not a lot of like key lighting. But we can kind of imagine. So I'm gonna like fake it in a little bit here. Like the basic idea is like if you are, I'm just gonna do this. If you are wanting to give something, make it feel more rendered, it comes down to like a gradient. And like that means like, okay, we're gonna put a little bit of light up here and we're gonna put a little darkness down here. And this pushing like sometimes I'll just do this as like an overlay or a soft light or hard light. But like you can see that like over the length of the socks here, it's kind of gradating as it goes up the length of the leg from darker to lighter. There's like these kind of intersecting gradients that happen when you're looking at rendering, where like there's the gradient that runs this way, like up the leg, but then there's like another one that kind of wraps around the leg. So like we just need to think about like, okay, well it's gonna be lighter on top and like darker on the bottom. So we can do something that's like maybe just a soft brush stroke, or maybe like literally a gradient, depending on how much we have blocked in. And like, it's really not about trying to meticulously push everything around. You can sometimes just like get this effect by like laying in like a literal gradient that runs across the whole length of the figure. But like what I'm doing when I'm thinking about lighting most of the time is I'm thinking about like, you know, these sort of larger, longer gradients that run across the whole form. So like it's going to be a lot lighter up towards the head and a lot darker down towards the feet, and that's going to give a sense of like spotlighting. And you can see it's like already happening even though I haven't done any kind of real detail. But then you also get like these smaller segmentations. Like you see like across the face, like if we think about moving across the face from like left to right here, I'm trying to get a brush that's actually going to show up. There we go. Left to right across this way, we can assume, okay, well, there's light coming in from the left side. So then we can just kind of like transition slowly, lighting from left to right, and we get like to round out the face a little bit. Same thing across the neck, you know, it's going from sort of left to right. And if we rough that in, we have kind of a rough structure for a, you know, a transition from left to right. And like, you know, when you start looking around for like simple transitions of where does it go from light to dark and then back to dark to light or whatever, you can see it here like in the hair. It's darker in the bottom left corner, and then as it kind of moves up into the right over here, it lightens as it gets towards the highlight. And then we get this again across the top of the head. It's like dark over here, and then it kind of, you know, there's this softer gradient as like, you know, we get the darker parts here, and then it's kind of lighter towards the middle, and like that's rendering. Like isn't it there's a, if you have like a million little gradients that kind of all overlap each other, you can end up with something that like looks rendered in the end. But like a lot of what I'm looking for is like, hey, look at this crease that's going up here inside the sweater. It's like darker as it's down towards the tip, and it gets lighter as it gets up there. So I'm not really focused on like what is the exact value everywhere along this whole chain. I'm more worried about like as I go to add in this crease, I could maybe say start off at 100%, do the whole crease all black, and then say, well, and then I'm going to slowly sort of push it down across the length of it here. And now as we get this gradient, now that's like a crease that's been like rendered. And so like a lot of, that's like what's happening in a lot of situations is that there's like either a subtle gradient, like you can see like the ambient occlusion shadow is basically just a gradient where it's like dark as it hits this edge, and then it goes, and then it kind of washes away and gets lighter. So we can go and lasso this off. And then with just black, go and hit this edge here. And there we go. You know, lighting. It's if you look around through a painting, you will often find that there are these kind of subtle gradients that are constantly happening everywhere. You'll notice like there's like obvious little ones, like, hey, these little ambient occlusion shadows where like the elbow meets the sweater here, easy to spot. But if you sort of zoom out, you might see like, oh, it's like a little bit lighter generally as it gets down here, and then it darkens a little bit as like the form turns upwards. And so like you can, you know, brush that in really softly at a distance to get a little bit of sense of the thing turning over a length. And you can see like it's a little bit lighter down here, a little bit darker up here. And that's how like we were sort of roughing in lighting. And if you are looking for it, you will spot it fucking everywhere. It's like there are always these like changes over a distance in the lighting. Like change it over the length from like head to toe, you know, from top to bottom, you know, around any given form, left to right, up and down. And like, if you're looking for those, you will be spotting them everywhere. And then if you're like, oh, my thing looks a little flat, the question isn't like, how do I add more detail? The question is like, how do I make transitions that sort of slowly go over the length of the figure? Like, you pick any large thing in the scene and like make a transition that happens over like a long distance. Even big flat objects, look at this. You can see this big flat piece of green back here is basically got this like shadow that is like this soft shadow here. And then there's a little bit of cast shadow here. But it's like these big soft shapes, these big soft transitions that happen over the long length of this. You would end up with a really weird, flat kind of graphic look if you were to completely flatten it out. But if you want to give it the sense of more 3D-ness, 3D-ness is often just like a subtle transition over a long space. So it really is just like, you know, there's I can do it here digitally very easily by washing in like a really soft, like a single brush stroke with a soft brush. But like an artist who's working traditionally won't necessarily be able to do like a big soft wash like this. So you're not necessarily like, when I'm starting off like blocking in a value pattern, I'm sometimes just doing these to like kind of kick off like, hey, is it generally going from darker to lighter as we get over here, and then like lighter to darker as we, you know, what do these like big transitions look like broadly if we were to just turn them into like a couple of soft brush strokes? But like what I'll see sometimes is like there's an artist like Eric Fortune who will do this, and he'll do it with like acrylic or ink on paper, and he has to do it by like let me pull up an example of his work. I love Eric Fortune's work. He's doing it in like the most manual, most painful way possible, which is always like crazy to see. Like you can see these like soft, subtle gradients in his figures here. This is being done by like, he's not able to do this in a big wash. This is like acrylic on paper, I think. Acrylic washes on canvas. And so he's like mixing slightly different colors. Like he's mixing like a slightly like darker color every centimeter that he goes like up and down these areas. Like these soft transitions here, these are all like him mixing slightly different colors and like progressively watering down or like mixing a different color in across these like long lengths. The same is true of if you see anybody that does like really, really precise graphite rendering, it's like there are like graphite powder techniques you can use to create gradients more quickly. But I've known plenty of artists that will create these like long, subtle gradients by like very carefully modulating like the way that they do shading over like huge distances. So like noticing it is like the first step, but then there's this process of like creating it using your tools can be either a very automatic and quick thing if you're doing like if you're working with airbrush or you're working digitally, like you can just use a digital airbrush. And it's easy to make like gradients like super, super simply. But like you can also do it like the insane way and like do it with a mechanical pencil, one grain at a time. One of my very first students ever, somebody named Rebecca Yanevskaya.
Oh yeah, her stuff's crazy.
Um,
Nuts. That's done with just like a ballpoint pen.
yeah, and so she does these. She does the same thing, but she does it with entirely with ballpoint pen. Oh, she's like, this is like a piece that she did with me like a decade ago. Still paying out. Still making money. But so she's doing these kinds of like soft, long transitions entirely using like ballpoint pen, one little scrape of like one little turn of the ball bearing at a time, slightly modulated pressure to create these like longer transitions, which is completely fucking crazy. It's not the way that people do things because it's the insanely hard way to do things. But doing digital studies or whatever, we can make this stuff happen really quickly. Or if you've got a really clean drawing, like Neil, like you do, you can go and like throw in some sort of loose brush strokes digitally to create a kind of digital watercolor that allows you to create these kinds of like soft transitions over long lengths of space really easily. And it's a pretty fast process. And like if you can do those kind of long transitions mixed with like these kind of smaller notes of like, we can see like over like I'm looking at this leg here. It's hard to make notes with a big brush. Looking along this axis of the leg here, you can see that it's brighter up here towards the kneecap, and then it's like slowly kind of transitioning here. It does a little bit of a sharper turn as we turn around the form there, but like if we wanted to, so like if we're looking to like recreate the lighting here, it really is just a matter of like looking at the transitions. We've got this kind of turning of form that's happening across the top of the knee, like around here. So there's this kind of axis around this way, and then as it dives down, we're like get this very, very soft transition. So what I'll do sometimes is I'll be grabbing a darker color and I'll just be sort of mushing it up one step at a time, and like maybe taking a lighter color and then mushing it downwards from that center. And like you can do that even with a hard edge brush if you like turn the flow down the way that I do. And it's really just a matter of like thinking about that transition over the length, over a longer length. It sometimes can be kind of subtle, so I think that people don't notice when I'm doing it because like it's like not a huge transition of value from up here to down here. And so I'm not like I sometimes, because I think about art this way, I sometimes struggle with cell shading, because cell shading is all about like finding like where is the exact cutoff point where a shadow, it stops being a highlight, starts becoming a shadow. But really I'm often looking for these larger zones of value like here and trying to notice like subtle transitions over the length of them. Like, oh, underneath the leg we have this like ambient occlusion shadow, and then it's kind of like still remaining sort of dark, and then it's lightening up, and then it's darkening again as it kind of comes closer to the under part of the skirt. And so I'm like considering this like transition over the length of the leg as the way in which I'm creating the lighting, which is like obviously not possible. If like you were to do this as cell shaded, you would probably just like take this one cast shadow here with this sort of ambient occlusion and like just pin that off as a shadow, and everything else would just be a different color. But like I've never been able to figure out how to get it to look quite right under those circumstances. I always feel like I want to have those like more subtle transitions in order to make it feel right. But the advantage of working with the lasso tool is that like you can make like a hard edge where like that, you can kind of cordon off like that little piece of where you want the color to go. Like what is the segment of the painting that you're working on, and then you can like inside that space work on some more subtle transitions. And then you end up with this mixture of soft edges and hard edges like really, really quickly. And like that is something I've not done a lot of over the years. Like I've gone through and tried to manually cut or soften every single edge by just using the brush tool, and just try to be careful about where I'm putting stuff. But I'm not actually that careful, and I'm not that coordinated. So I tend to have a lot of accidental marks that make a lot of like accidental mush all over the place, and I spend all my time cleaning it up later. But like, if I can build a habit for using the lasso tool, then I can theoretically start to be able to handle some of that stuff more quickly with like less mess, and then I'm able to like build in these like smaller transitions without having to like worry about it overlapping into other edges and stuff. Like, you can see the way it pops out of the knee here. You know, with the lasso tool, you can really easily carve it up. But like, without using the lasso tool, the way I've typically done it is by like turning the brush up to 100% opacity, and then manually trying to carve the edge by just running the brush lengthwise across where that edge needs to be. Which means that I don't need to like switch tools or like think. I can just like watch television while I'm working.